Some days you just want to amplify your everyday look. Like when you want the look of false lashes without the extra effort, reach for Thrive Cosmetics Liquid Lash Volumizer Mascara. Or when you want all eyes on your smile, keep Empower Gloss Ultra Glossy Lip Serum in your bag. It's a burst of 24-hour hydration that smooths like a serum, shines like a gloss, and can be worn sheer or layered. You'll always look and feel your best with Thrive Cosmetics. Plus, every product is 100% vegan, cruelty-free, and made with clean, skin-loving ingredients that work with your skin, not against it. Amplify your everyday. Go to thrivecosmetics.com/shine26 for an exclusive offer of 20% off your first order. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/shine26.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez. Tonight we're looking at the life and work of Edvard Munch, the Norwegian artist best known for the Scream, one of the most recognizable and unsettling images in history. Most people know that painting, but many don't know that Munch also created a work later called Vampire, a piece that sparked decades of debate over its meaning. It wasn't intended as a supernatural scene, yet its mood and imagery connected Munch to themes of emotional darkness and gothic sorrow. This isn't a story about ghosts or curses. There are no legends here, no haunted houses or unexplained figures in the night. Munch's world was much quieter, and in many ways, much heavier. His fears came from illness, loss, anxiety, and the weight of memory. He painted not what he saw, but what he felt. And what he felt often bordered on despair. In this episode, we'll talk about Munch's early life surrounded by sickness, the emotional events that shaped him, the moment that inspired the Scream, and why some viewers saw vampire-like themes in one of his most controversial works. We'll also look at his struggles with mental health and the legacy he left behind, a body of art that continues to unsettle because it reflects fears we rarely speak about, but all understand. Some stories frighten us with shadows. Others remind us that the human mind can be just as haunting. Tonight, we explore the fears that shaped Edvard Munch. Edvard Munch was born in Norway on December 12, 1863. From the beginning, life in his home was shaped more by sickness than celebration. His family was large and close, but poor health followed them. Winters were long, resources were limited, and the cold climate did little to help anyone fighting illness. When Munch was 5 years old, his mother, Laura, died from tuberculosis. At the time, tuberculosis was a leading cause of death across Europe, and treatment options were limited. Homes with one sick family member often saw the disease spread through the household. For the Munch family, that pattern continued. Edvard watched his older sister Sophie become sick in the same way. She died at the age of 15 when Edvard was 14. He would never forget it. Her illness and the quiet suffering surrounding it would later appear in his paintings again and again. Munch's father, Christian, was deeply religious and struggled emotionally after losing his wife. He raised his children with strict discipline and a strong belief in faith and repentance. In a home already touched by grief, this created an atmosphere of fear and worry. Illness wasn't just a medical condition. At times, it felt like a spiritual trial. For a young child, that type of environment left lasting impressions. Another sister, Laura, developed severe mental health struggles later in life and spent long periods in psychiatric care. His younger brother, Andreas, died young as well, only a few months after finishing medical school. One by one, the people around him were taken by sickness or suffering. By the time Munch reached adulthood, he had experienced more personal loss than most people see in a lifetime. Munch himself was often ill as a child, spending long stretches indoors. While other children played outside, he drew. He sketched scenes from his imagination, from memory, and from the world around him. Illness kept him isolated, but it also gave him time to develop his artistic ability. Drawing became a way to cope, a quiet outlet in a home where grief and worry were constant. Later in life, Munch wrote, "Illness, madness, and death were the black angels that stood at my cradle and followed me through life." For him, this wasn't poetic language. It was simply the truth. His early years taught him that life could change quickly and painfully, and those lessons shaped how he saw the world. For many people, childhood memories are filled with school, friends, and holidays. For Munch, they were filled with hospital beds, prayers, and silent rooms where loved ones fought for breath. It is understandable that his view of life, love, and fear would lean toward the somber. Instead of ghosts or monsters, he grew up with something more immediate: the fear of losing the people closest to him. This foundation, shaped by sickness, faith, and loss, would influence everything he created. His paintings were never just pictures. They were records of emotion, memory, and scenes that never left him. Long before the scream or the debate around his vampire painting, his life had already introduced him to the kind of fear that stays inside, the kind that doesn't need a shadow in the hallway to feel real. For Edvard Munch, the haunting began at home, not from anything supernatural, but from the quiet weight of grief that followed him from childhood onward. As Munch moved into his teenage years, the losses he experienced at home didn't fade. They settled into his memory. Illness, fear, and funerals weren't separate events. They were part of everyday life. Instead of pushing those experiences aside, he used them. Art became his way to understand what he had lived through. Munch began formal art training in his late teens. He learned traditional techniques and studied established painters, but the academic style never interested him. His early work already showed a different focus. He wasn't drawn to clean portraits or peaceful landscapes. He painted emotion. He painted memory. He painted pain the way he remembered it, not neat or controlled, but raw and uneven. One of his first major works reflecting this approach was The Sick Child. The painting was inspired by the death of his sister Sophie. Instead of showing a perfect likeness or a detailed medical scene, he painted the feeling of losing her. The brushstrokes are rough, the colors are muted and heavy. The figures seem tired and resigned, as if the moment has lasted longer than anyone can bear. When The Sick Child was first displayed in 1886, many critics reacted negatively. They said the painting looked unfinished. They didn't understand why the lines were blurred or why the strokes looked rushed. But those details weren't mistakes. They were deliberate. Munch wasn't trying to recreate a photograph. He was trying to show grief the way it stays in the mind. It doesn't stay sharp. It fades at the edges, but the feeling remains clear. This approach set Munch apart. Instead of focusing on physical detail, he focused on emotional truth. He once wrote, "I do not paint what I see, but what I saw." It was a simple statement, but it explained everything about his style. His art wasn't about the present moment. It was about memory, trauma, and how experiences shape a person long after they end. As he continued to develop, his subjects remained consistent. He painted parents mourning children, pale figures in quiet rooms, and people weighed down by sadness or anxiety. His work didn't avoid difficult feelings, it confronted them directly. Where others looked for beauty in light and scenery, Munch found meaning in silence and stillness. The moments after tragedy, when a house feels different and life feels smaller. During this time, he also experienced the artistic movements happening around Europe. Impressionism and naturalism were popular, but he wasn't interested in copying them. He absorbed ideas but returned to his mission, to show emotional reality. His work was personal, but it also spoke to universal experiences. Anyone who had felt loss could recognize something familiar in his paintings, even if they didn't like how they looked. Over time, Munch became part of a group of artists who valued inner truth more than outward appearance. This approach eventually became part of Expressionism, a movement where emotion mattered more than realism. Munch didn't invent the movement on his own, but he helped define it. His style told others that art could be honest without being beautiful, and powerful without being precise. In these early years, Munch learned something important. Grief doesn't disappear when time passes. It changes form. It becomes part of the person who survives it. And for him, the only way to live with that weight was to put it on canvas. Brushstroke by brushstroke, memory by memory. He built a career not from joy or celebration, but from the painful things people tried not to think about. His paintings weren't meant to frighten audiences. They weren't meant to comfort them either. They simply reflected what he knew, that life can be fragile, that sadness lingers, and that emotions don't stay quiet forever. For Edvard Munch, art wasn't escape, it was honesty.
Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
By the early 1890s, Munch had already spent years exploring sadness, memory, and loneliness through his work. But one experience would shape his most famous painting and define his legacy. It wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no strange figures in the night or unexplained shadows in the corner of a room. It was a simple walk at sunset, and the feeling that came with it. Munch later described the moment in a diary entry. He was walking with two friends along a road overlooking the city of Christiania, which is now Oslo. The day had been normal, conversation light, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the sun set, he stopped. The sky turned a deep, intense red. His friends continued walking, but he remained still, looking out over the landscape. In his words, "I felt a great scream pass through nature." He didn't say he heard a scream. He said he felt one. A sudden wave of panic and dread washed over him. His body reacted before his mind had time to understand it. His breathing changed. His heart pounded. The world around him didn't look threatening, but it didn't feel safe either. It was an emotional shift, the kind that arrives quickly, without warning. Today, this moment is often understood as a panic or anxiety episode. Munch struggled with his mental health throughout his life, and this may have been an early, intense example of it. But there was more happening around him than personal emotion alone. Around that time, skies across parts of Europe were unusually red due to volcanic ash from the Krakatoa eruption years earlier. The atmosphere had changed, and the sunsets looked unnatural. Many people wrote about how eerie the sky appeared. Even without anxiety, the view would have felt unsettling to anyone standing there. In that moment, Munch felt overwhelmed not just by the sky, but by everything he carried with him: childhood loss, illness in the family, fear of death, and the constant awareness of how fragile life could be. The landscape didn't frighten him. His own emotional world did. The scream wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. When he returned home, he didn't paint the scene right away. The memory stayed with him, and later, he began to put it on canvas. He didn't paint realistic sky or realistic figures. He painted the feeling, the swirling color, the distorted perspective, the expression of shock and terror on the central figure. The two friends in the background continue walking, unaware of the emotional collapse happening just steps away. That detail mattered. It showed how fear can feel private, even when we're surrounded by others. The scream wasn't meant to be supernatural or mysterious. It wasn't meant to depict a literal scream at all. The figure in the painting doesn't appear to be shouting. Their hands press against their face as if trying to block something out. Many historians believe the figure is reacting to the scream they feel, not making one. The fear in the painting is internal, not external. This moment became the turning point in Munch's career. It wasn't just about sorrow anymore. It was about anxiety, sudden, overwhelming, and difficult to explain. A quiet reminder that the most frightening experiences aren't always the ones we can point to. Sometimes they are moments when everything feels wrong without any clear reason. For Munch, the sky didn't just change color, the world shifted. And that single moment of panic, triggered by memory and the weight of life, would go on to become one of the most famous images of fear ever created. When Munch finally translated that moment of panic onto canvas, he didn't make just one version. Between 1893 and 1910, he created several paintings, drawings, and even a lithograph. This was not a single work, but a theme he returned to. Each version captured the same feeling: overwhelming fear that rises from within and changes how the world looks. The figure at the center of the scream is one of the most recognizable images on Earth, but it's also misunderstood. It isn't someone yelling into the void. Instead, many scholars agree the figure appears to be reacting to something, covering its ears as if trying to block out a sound no one else can hear. The fear is internal. The terror is personal. The world around warps to match what the mind feels. Behind them, two figures walk calmly in the distance. They represent everything Munch felt at that moment: isolation, separation from others, and the sense that his fear was invisible to everyone else. They continue forward without pause, while the central figure struggles to steady themselves. It's not a dramatic scene. It's a moment of emotional collapse hidden inside everyday life. The swirling sky and twisting landscape weren't accidents. They served one purpose: to show how fear distorts perception. When anxiety strikes, nothing feels solid. Colors feel too bright, sounds too sharp, and familiar places become unfamiliar. Munch wasn't painting a location, he was painting a state of mind. When the scream was first shown, reactions were mixed. Some called it unsettling. Others dismissed it as strange or exaggerated. But many recognized something honest in it. They saw panic, real panic, captured on canvas at a time when emotional struggles weren't openly discussed. The late 1800s and early 1900s were not a time when mental health was widely understood. Society valued restraint and control. Munch painted the opposite. He painted vulnerability. Years later, scientists and art historians discovered a faint pencil inscription on one version of the painting. It reads, could only have been painted by a madman. At first, it was unclear who wrote it. Some believed it was vandalism left by a viewer. But modern analysis confirmed that Munch himself wrote those words. It wasn't a dramatic statement. It was likely a quiet response to criticism. Many people questioned his sanity during his life, and that comment shows how aware he was of their judgment. But Munch didn't create the scream to shock anyone. He wasn't trying to unsettle people or change the art world. He was simply trying to reflect what he felt at a specific moment. That honesty is what gives the painting its power. It does not rely on monsters, shadows, or violence. It relies on something simpler and more universal: the fear that rises suddenly without warning, and reminds us that we are not always in control. Today, the scream is often associated with horror and unease. It appears in Halloween decorations, films, and cultural references, but the real story behind it isn't supernatural. The painting reflects something many people experience but rarely talk about: the quiet panic that can appear in an ordinary moment, for reasons we can't always explain. For Munch, fear wasn't a legend or a creature lurking in the dark. It was something personal, a feeling that rushed over him without warning, and in capturing it, he created an image that continues to speak to people who have felt that same surge of unexplained dread. The unsettling power of the scream doesn't come from mystery, it comes from truth. While the scream remains Munch's most famous work, another painting often discussed in connection with him is Love and Pain, later commonly known as Vampire. It was created in 1895 and immediately sparked debate. The painting shows a woman leaning over a man, her arms around him, her face close to his neck. Her long red hair falls over his shoulders. To some viewers, the scene appeared intimate and comforting. To others, it looked predatory. The title Vampire did not come from Munch. The name was applied by critics and viewers who saw something darker in the scene. At a time when Gothic literature was popular and vampire stories were becoming part of European culture, the imagery fueled imagination. The woman's posture, the red hair, and the man's bowed head created an impression of emotional surrender, or emotional consumption. Munch rejected the vampire interpretation. He insisted the painting represented love, not supernatural fear. To him, the woman was comforting the man, not harming him. But interpretation is not always controlled by the artist. Once the image left his studio, it lived in the public's eye. The vampire label stuck, and the painting became associated with emotional pain and draining relationships. Later versions and woodcut prints deepened the theme. The embrace remained close and heavy. The man's posture remained weighted and still. Whether viewers saw protection or destruction depended on how they approached the image. Munch's experience with grief, loss, and emotional intensity was visible, regardless of interpretation. The painting's power comes from its ambiguity. There is no violence, no fangs, and no dramatic struggle. There is only closeness, the kind that can heal or harm depending on circumstance. Many people recognize something familiar in the scene: the idea that love and suffering can exist side by side. Emotional connection can bring comfort, but it can also drain someone who is already vulnerable. The painting reflected the complicated nature of relationships rather than a literal myth. Despite Munch's objection, the vampire interpretation helped cement his reputation as an artist willing to explore dark emotional themes. It connected him, unintentionally, to Gothic symbolism. Not through fantasy or supernatural storytelling, but through the emotional weight his art carried. Viewers felt something unsettling in the work, and so they gave it a name that matched the mood: even if it wasn't the one Munch chose. Today, art historians view love and pain as a study of vulnerability. The man leans forward as if exhausted. The woman holds him close, and the scene could be interpreted as care or dominance. Munch wasn't illustrating folklore. He was illustrating emotion. But the vampire title shows how quickly people attach narrative to feelings they can't easily explain. For audiences drawn to dark and haunting themes, this painting sits beside The Scream as another example of Munch's ability to touch on fear without using traditional horror imagery. Not fear of monsters, but fear of becoming consumed by grief, by love, or by memory. Munch didn't paint legends. He painted the parts of life that feel heavy and inescapable. And in this case, the world supplied the myth for him. As Munch's career progressed, the emotions behind his art did not fade. If anything, they became heavier. He struggled with anxiety and depression throughout his adult life. Fame did not offer comfort, and public criticism often weighed on him. The same sensitivity that fueled his work also made daily life difficult. Munch drank heavily during stressful periods, and his mental health declined as he entered his mid-40s. By the early 1900s, the strain became impossible to ignore. He experienced severe anxiety, mood swings, and paranoia. Loud noises startled him. Interactions became tense. Friends grew concerned. Munch himself knew something was wrong. He later admitted that his nerves were worn thin, and he could no longer manage the pressure he carried. In 1908, he suffered a major breakdown. At that point, he made a decision that was uncommon for the era. He sought help. He admitted himself to a clinic in Copenhagen, where he spent several months receiving treatment. Doctors encouraged rest, fresh air, and limited alcohol. It wasn't a cure, but it offered structure and stability during a time when his thoughts felt overwhelming. Even in treatment, Munch continued to draw. He sketched nurses, doctors, and the quiet moments inside the clinic. Art remained his way of understanding life, even when life felt fragile. The environment allowed him to slow down, and gradually, he stabilized. When he left, he returned to Norway and moved to the countryside, choosing a quieter environment away from the pressures of city life. After his time in treatment, Munch's work shifted. The themes of illness and despair remained part of him, but he also painted workers, landscapes, and everyday scenes. He never abandoned emotional depth, but his focus broadened. Some historians see this as an attempt to rebuild balance, to find subjects that did not rely solely on pain. Others believe the change reflected a period of healing. However, he never fully escaped his past. The losses from childhood, the struggles of adulthood, and the burden of constant introspection remained with him. They were part of his identity. His art continued to reflect vulnerability and fear, although sometimes with more calmness than before. He lived quietly, surrounded by his paintings, which he considered companions. When asked about his work late in life, he said he felt protective over it, as if each piece carried a part of himself. Despite challenges, Munch lived to old age. He died in 1944 at the age of 80. By then, his status as a major figure in modern art was secure. Museums, critics, and collectors recognized the significance of what he had done, not because he painted beautiful scenes, but because he painted honest ones. His later years serve as a reminder that the people who create dark and emotional work are not thinking about legacy or fame in the moment. Often, they are trying to understand themselves. Munch didn't paint to frighten others. He painted because he needed to put his feelings somewhere. He needed a way to live with them. His story does not end in dramatic mystery or sudden tragedy. It ends quietly, after a long life shaped by emotion and reflection. The sadness never left him, but he learned to live alongside it. His journey shows that the mind can be both fragile and resilient, and that facing inner darkness does not always mean being consumed by it. For Munch, recovery wasn't a single moment. It was a slow process of acknowledging pain, seeking help, and continuing to create. And while his art often feels heavy, his survival speaks to something equally true. Even those who carry fear can endure. Edvard Munch's life and art are often discussed in dramatic terms, but nothing about his story depends on the supernatural. There are no curses attached to his paintings, no haunted objects, and no legends of spirits appearing in his studio late at night. The fears he expressed came from real experiences: childhood illness, loss, anxiety, and the uncertainty that followed him into adulthood. From a skeptic's perspective, the scream can be explained through psychology and science. The moment Munch described, the red sky, the sudden panic, aligns with what we now understand as a panic attack. The intense red sunset may have been influenced by volcanic ash lingering in the atmosphere after the Krakatoa eruption. The twisting shapes and unnatural colors in the painting were not visions of something paranormal. They were artistic choices used to communicate emotional distress. His struggles with mental health also follow patterns we recognize today: anxiety, depression, trauma from early losses. They shaped his perception of the world. Even without folklore or paranormal events, his work feels haunting because it speaks to experiences many people hold quietly: fear of illness, fear of losing loved ones, fear of losing control, and the sudden dread that can appear without warning. Those emotions don't require superstition to feel real. They exist in everyday life, in private moments, and in memories that stay long after time has passed. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Halloween Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or want to suggest a topic for a future show, send me an email at thehalloweenpodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit us on our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. Don't forget to check out our Facebook page at facebook.com/thehalloweenpodcast. Thanks again for listening, and have a good night.